2 of Sant Jordi USA Festival of Books, Roses, and the Arts. Today is publishing day, and we are breaking a lance, as they say in Catalan, for publishing as resistance. So here, this is Publishers' Superpowers, Opposition, Resistance, and Translation. And we're at the beautiful Jersey City Theater Center, which is our new home in Jersey City. And Nia Thomas is here from Comma Press in Manchester, UK. And Margot Atwell is here from Feminist Press here in New York. Margot, I think you haven't even been executive editor for a month, right?
I just passed a month, but barely.
Yeah, so this is a very exciting thing to have Margot so soon in her tenure and starting a new stage for Feminist Press after 50 years of publishing. Margot and Nia have in common that they have founded a lot of things. I'd love it if you talked about, you've founded a magazine in Manchester and you went back, Salt yeah. Manchester, and founded a micro press. Mm-hmm. So it would be great to talk a little bit about that, and then I'll introduce the people on screen.
Sure. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I wasn't expecting you to bring up Salt, but that's cool.
I thought it was cool. That's what I wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, I co-founded Salt magazine in Manchester with 2 friends after graduating, basically with the intention of kind of just reflecting the cultural scene that's there at the moment and going for more kind of long-form journalism and coverage. And yeah, basically we're funded by our readers and we cover what we want when we want. so yeah, that's Salt. And
it sounds like Sant Jordi a little.
Yeah. It's good fun. It's good fun.
And good training. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's I'll let you.
And Margot, how did you go from from Gumshoe to Gumshoe?
Yeah.
To Feminist Press? What was the arc?
Well, it's funny that you bring up the idea of founding things. I realize I've founded quite a lot of things. I co-founded a literary magazine called Labrys in college with 2 friends. I co-founded a website about roller derby called derbylife.com. It's no longer with us, but we published a lot of weird things for a lot of years. And then I founded Gut Punch Press, which was my micro press, to publish a book about roller derby. And it's interesting. I feel like Feminist Press, which just passed its 52nd year, was started also to publish works of literature by women and other folks who were not being published and not part of the canon at the time. So I feel like a lot of independent publishing grows out of people just saying, well, this kind of thing should be out there. It should be documented. It should be between covers.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a lot of that in independent publishing.
No, we were talking about that last night too. So I hope we can get back into it. And on screen is a publisher of Comma Press, Rob Page from Manchester. Frank Wynne from Dublin, right, Frank?
That's not where I am, but I'm originally from Ireland, certainly.
Where are you? I'm sorry.
I am in a sort of halfway fugue state between London, between the UK and Spain at the moment. By tomorrow, I'll be in Spain, but today I'm not.
Okay, so anticipatorily, your head is in Spain.
Absolutely.
And Allison Markin Powell is coming in from Vermont. Allison is translates from Japanese, and she is, we've met on the Penn Translation Committee. We've been co-chairs of the Penn Translation Committee, and Allison is now a member of the board. And she is a translation activist and has done a great deal to perfect the model contract on the Penn website. And Frank is uh, the president of the Booker International Award right now, prize of the jury, and translates from Spanish, French, what else?
Portuguese when no one's looking.
When no one's looking. That's what I thought. I've certainly missed things. So if you, Rob, if you would like to give us a little bit of background on Comma Press and beyond what Nia told us, you know, why you founded it and how, what is its superpower?
I'm not sure about any superpowers. So Common Press was set up, well, it was initially sort of officially founded in 2007, though it was running as a kind of an unincorporated group for a couple of years before that. Its mission really is to publish short fiction, short stories. It was originally kind of set up when there was no platform for short fiction, or there was very, very few kind of platforms for short stories in the UK at the time. The market had completely fallen out from under it. So we founded it really to give a space, as Margot said, to give a space to something that wasn't really there. And we published almost exclusively short fiction, which is completely unheard of, really. There's a couple of novels and books of poetry out there that we've put out there, but it's pretty much 99% short fiction, and a lot of that is also short fiction in translation. So it's like a Venn diagram of things that are difficult to sell. But
here's the question: are they really difficult to sell? I mean, is the bugbear of publishing true, or not?
It depends what you mean by sell. It depends what kind of numbers you're talking about. I was always told that short stories, you can't give them away. So one of the first things that I did was give them away through pull-out supplements in magazines, listings magazines, and local magazines. So there is a bit of a paradox. If you ask people to name their 10 favorite things they've ever read, they often mention one or two short stories in there, but if you ask the same person on a different day if they ever read short stories, they'll tell you they don't. So there's a kind of buying into this myth that that short stories aren't very popular, even by the people that like them. So they're difficult to market. That's the big issue, and so they don't really fit into kind of marketing formula. When you review or talk about or recommend a collection of short stories, a single author collection, you've got 10, 15 different stories to summarize in talking about that book. So it's quite difficult to kind of turn into into an elevator pitch, pardon me. So yeah, they're difficult to market, and then the kind of narrative follows from that they're difficult to sell. But we've survived. We're still around, and if you kind of package them in the right way, and if you bring them to the market in the right way, I think they are very eminently sellable.
So I have to say I love short stories. I think I like them better than novels. They're sort of little novels, and you get the whole a very big bang for the buck. But some of the literatures I love have great short story traditions, including English. So what is the right way? How much feminism is short story collections? And
I couldn't do the percentage off the top of my head, but we definitely publish short story collections. We primarily do fiction, both novels and short story collections, nonfiction, and we do a lot of works in translation, primarily fiction.
One of the writers we were talking about yesterday, Pere Caldés, was in exile in Mexico after the Civil War. And he became a prolific short story writer. But his explanation was that he had a full-time job. He set up set up a publishing house in Mexico and left a great publishing tradition when he left. And he said, I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and all I can write are short stories. He didn't have, so there's an economy to the short story, I think. That's really interesting. Frank, have you translated short stories, or do you mostly do novels?
I have, but short stories, the short story is the last of all possible literary forms that was invented. It was invented in the 19th century because there were magazines and they wanted short fiction. And therefore, you know, in English, the short story exists almost entirely in the 19th century and up to the middle of the 20th century. And what you lose then are the literary magazines that publish stories, and therefore there is no room for them. Short stories were never conceived as, here is a collection of short stories, go and read them. That may be how that works now, but it certainly wasn't the case when Maupassant, when Chekhov, when the people we think of as beginning the short story were writing. And I think one of the reasons that it's difficult in English in a way that it is less difficult to say in French, in Spanish, in German, in Dutch, in the various languages in which I read, is that they all still have major literary magazines that publish short stories. And therefore, when you come to when there's a collection of short stories, it is a collection of stories that have been published. And there has already been an awareness of the author out there. I mean, this was also a period in which, you know, novels were serialized, in which literature was very much more a part of the average person's reading. And therefore, the literature that then came out in book form was something that, you know, they might have read part of in a magazine, but they were certainly aware of. And it's one of the things that we've lost. We have ended up with publishing being seen as something that's over there. The other thing that's I'd be interested to know from various viewpoints, the extent to which literature is covered. I mean, in the United Kingdom and indeed in Ireland, there is not a single program on radio, on television, on anything that is devoted to talking about literature. None. Whereas I can think of examples in French and Spanish and in most countries where there are programs whose primary function is that they just talk about books. And we don't anymore.
Okay, so let's go on for a moment about, I don't know about whether the short story is a particularly good vehicle for resistance, but we were also going to talk about publishing as resistance in the case of Comma Press, but also in the case of Feminist Press. So
I think what this conversation kind of has started to open up is that, as Ra was saying, like there's this narrative that the short story is a hard sell. So who is it that, you know, picks up the short story but independent presses? Mm-hmm. And that kind of brings to light the value that independent presses have. And it's, you know, it's the fact that they're taking the risks to publish the stories that, you know, on paper might not look sellable, and that, you know, bigger corporate publishers can't take those risks. And I think that's probably something, I don't know if you found that with what you're able to publish with the Feminist Press as well.
Definitely most of what's on our list would not look like the mainstream marketable darling of a Big Five imprint. And I think that the question about independent publishing as resistance is a really interesting one. The Feminist Press's entire mission is to publish marginalized and insurgent writers. So it's kind of baked into the fabric of Feminist Press to publish voices that are resisting the mainstream, sort of talking outside of and against the mainstream in a lot of ways. I don't know if that's part of what Comma does as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like, our, I think that's part of the appeal of like an anthology of short stories, is those different viewpoints that we're able to pull together. Yeah, Ra, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I think I didn't go on to talk about why short stories were important to us, but it enables us to kind of decentralize narratives in many different ways. So, as a publisher, as an independent publisher outside of London, we're very keen to decentralize where our narratives are set. So there's a sense that so much media is focused around London in the UK and in England that everything is sort of tried and tested in London and the home counties, and what works there is just rolled out to the rest of the country. And if the rest of the country appears in literature a lot of the time, or certainly when I set the press up, it appears as a kind of an exoticized space. You know, a huge deal is made out of the fact that it's from the Midlands, or it's set in the north of England, etc., etc. So the idea with Comma originally was to commission lots and lots of short stories from set in cities around the UK, but not in London. And we followed that through with our Book of the City series, or Reading the City series, which often focuses on not so obvious cities, not kind of literary metropoli or epicenters, as much as places that you don't hear or you don't get to access much literature from. So,
well, and
so you know,
along those lines, let's introduce translation then, because there's not a few things more decentralizing than translation, I think. And well, I'd like to talk about both of your presses and what you do with translation and Feminist Press, because we've been concentrating on short stories, but you have other kinds of fiction. But I'd love to hear about the translation.
Yeah, we just published a book called Blood Feast. It's short stories. I'm blanking on the name of the author, which please forgive me. But I believe
we have it over there.
we do. Yeah, I'm so very
I'll
new
go get it.
in this
I'll go
role.
get
And it's translated.
It is translated. We published, I believe, 3 books of translation last year.
Wow.
And one of them was the first time the author had ever been translated. 2 of them was their first translation into English.
Feminist Press published a translation of mine last year, actually. So.
Which one was yours?
Black Box by Shiori Ito, which is nonfiction, which is unusual.
Okay.
There's not a lot of narrative nonfiction translated from Japanese. So I was honored to be published by Feminist Press, and it was a delightful experience, a very important book as well.
Yeah, that was one of the books that we were selling at AWP a few weeks ago, and I believe that the author is the one who founded Japan's, or sort of kicked off Japan's version of the Me Too movement, which talk about publishing and resistance. It's a huge deal. Actually, yes.
We wanted, yes, I chose Black Box.
This is the one that Allison translated.
This is Allison Markin Powell's translation.
And this is what I was talking about, Blood Feast, by Malika Mustradaf, translated by Alice Guthrie. And it's translated, it's Moroccan literature.
I'm sorry, did I interrupt you with the books? Because I was thinking maybe Allison might want to tell us a little bit about Black Box and why she chose it, and how it fits into decentering narratives.
Well, I'm see if I can try and fit that book specifically into this conversation. So we've been talking about short fiction, but what Margot was saying was that, I mean, so Shiori Ito is the author of this book, Black Box, which basically by sheer coincidence of timing, that book was published in October of 2017 in Japan. And because of that, the author became the face of Me Too in Japan by the nature of the book. The book is about her experience of sexual assault by a very prominent journalist in Japan, and her struggle with the criminal investigative system and the judicial system in Japan. And so, you know, it was the person who her accused assaulter had written two biographies of the then prime minister at the time. So she was kind of like kryptonite, like people, it was not easy to get funding or to get support for the publishing of that book. So I think that may have been one of the reasons why it was attractive to Feminist Press. I mean, the subject matter, but also her sort of position. I mean, she became very prominent, but also then basically had to leave Japan, could not live in Japan any longer, but was then named, Time Magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people of 2020, I believe. So that was the year before the book was published. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that I was thinking of too, though, while everybody was speaking about publishing strategies, was wondering about whether or not the larger corporations, if you ever feel like they are sort of catching, when you have success with your strategies of resistance, if you sometimes then feel like they are co-opting some of your.
Oh, can I jump in there? Because I think publishing as resistance is something that happens in waves. I mean, what we currently call the big five, or the big four these days, is in fact a whole bunch of independent presses. The great presses in Britain after the Second World War were largely run by mostly Jewish, mostly European immigrants. They were George Weidenfeld, who founded Weidenfeld and Nicholson, and Andre Deutsch, and Victor Gollancz, and John Calder, and all of these were extraordinarily independent presses. I mean, when William Heinemann was an independent press, it had both an African writers series and a Caribbean writers series, in which it published numerous books, both in translation and directly in English. What has happened is, as they became successful, they were bought, they were merged, and so there is no such thing as the African Writers / Caribbean Writers series in Heinemann still technically exists. They haven't published a single book in that for more than 30 years now. Similarly, you know, when Harville Press existed originally, you know, this is where Murakami was first published. This is where Henning Mankell was first published. This is where lots of writers in translation were first published. Once it was bought as part of Random House, then it loses that independence and it stops being part of that. And actually it becomes part of the, you know, rather safe world of corporate publishing. So actually the resistance will be fine until someone comes knocking on your door and asks to buy you. And that is what has historically happened. I mean, Chatham and Windus, which was, you know, began as the Hogarth Press, is now part of Penguin Random House. Virago is which successfully resisted several times being taken over. So yes, what happens is you resist, you create a demand for something new. Somebody looks at it and thinks, ooh, that's interesting. Why do we just buy you instead of actually trying to do something?
Rod,
And
do you have any?
It's not just the publishing houses that are bought. It's the authors that are often bought, cherry picked, and sometimes you end up sharing an author's work. You might publish, you know, an independent press might publish the short fiction or the more experimental work, whilst the corporate will publish their more successful novels. So yeah, the independent often does the kind of heavy lifting and the R&D, which you know, finding new markets, finding new spaces for new voices, which the corporates then sort of cherry pick off the successful versions of that. But there is a problem with that process, because, as you say, not only is the independence of the presses lost when they are bought, but also there's a sense that writers and publishers are co-opted into, effectively recuperated. They're assimilated, they're sanitized, they're repackaged and commodified, and spat out, regurgitated into the world, in the way that only capitalism knows how to do. And that kind of eating away at the periphery and then regurgitating through the center kind of loses the point of what the periphery was about, and the periphery is about.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very sort of problematic process, and it's and success in quotes is also, spiritually or culturally, it's failure, because it's a centralization, and it's a recuperation of those radical peripheries. So yeah, it's a very sort of bittersweet experience for an independent publisher to find a writer, and then see that writer do well, and then find that writer kind of bought by a corporate, and then repackaged, in the center. Although at an individual level, it's great for those writers, and it's especially great when those writers are, genuinely new types of voices, representing different communities that haven't been represented before, and it's fantastic for those individually. But you do wonder about the system, which just incorporates them and recuperates them because through the profit motive, because all those fantastic publishers that you just listed, Frank, as you say, their vision, their belief, their kind of their mission is lost when it's just a unit within a huge corporate architecture, with each one of those units needing to justify its profit motive and nothing else, really.
No, I mean, these are no longer publishers in any real sense. They are imprints, and buying is done. Titles are taken by individual editors to an editorial meeting where, in most of them, certainly in Macmillan and within Penguin Random House, your average editorial meeting includes people from sales and marketing and from comms who have not even read the book, and who will offer an opinion as to whether or not they can sell it based on not reading it. This is too, I mean, when Shuggie Bain was being touted a year and a half ago, it had been bought in the United States because Douglas now lives in the United States and has done for many years. When it was offered in the United Kingdom, only one editor even offered for it, because most people thought it was too small, too queer, too Scottish. Now everybody wants him, but that's fine.
Based on the conversation, I would like to ask you about one of the things that the marketing people adduce as a point against the sale of a book is the name of the translator on the cover, which, Frank, you have recently made, which we translators have been activist about, and you've recently also made a cry for proper payment of royalties and all of that. I just wanted to say there was a really poignant tweet today by a translator who said, how is it that publishers manage to try to make us feel guilty for being paid what we should be paid? So I would like to throw it on Frank, who's been making a big noise about this, but also on Ra and Margot. How can we protect translators and authors, in fact, from the fact that they are, that the lowest person on the food chain, in a sense. I remember just one more anecdote when Kim Mun-zo stopped translating because he said, the person who does the cover of the book in 20 minutes or 3 days is paid as much or more than I am as the translator who spent 6 months. So he said, I'm not going to do it anymore. So this is the second half of our conversation.
Okay, well, the main point really is that translation historically was seen as a hobby. It was something you did in your spare time. One of the reasons that there are a disproportionate number of women who translate is because it was something you did in your spare time. It didn't matter whether you were Helen Lowe Porter translating Thomas Mann, but you weren't allowed to actually be in touch with Thomas Mann because he was a writer and you were just Helen Lowe Porter, or Constance Garnett, or whatever. This was considered to be a hobby. And until, I mean, this is still very true in the United States, less true in the UK, the model for translation was what is referred to as work made for hire. This means that legally, the publisher is the author of the translation. They can change it if they wish, they can republish it if they wish, they do not have to ask the translator anything. There are a number of publishers who still do this in the United Kingdom. There are a lot more who do it in the United States, and it is very, very common across Europe. I mean, the role of translators in English is still significantly better than, say, it is in Italy, where all work is work made for hire. You put 16 translators in a room and you give them 2 weeks to do a book, and none of them owns a share of that book. But it is something that has changed, and changed enormously, even in the short time that I've been working as a translator, in the 20 years I've been working. And that is through PEN, through ALTA, through the Translators Association here, through the BCLT, through all sorts of other things. My issue with translators on covers, I mean, I don't really mind where on the cover the translator's name goes, but, you know, when I raised this recently, people were saying, well, what about the author? I mean, there are a number of people who could translate a book, but there's only one author for that book. Yeah, there are a number of people who can play the Goldberg variations. They're still by Bach, but I want to know who's playing them. I'm not going to buy the version otherwise. I'm not going to go and see Hedda Gabler unless I know who's playing Hedda Gabler. You know, we take it for granted that with plays, with music, with all sorts of things, the person who interprets did not create it, but is nonetheless an important part of bringing it to you. And the equivalent is, you know, obviously, I can read the book in French. I do not need somebody to translate it for me. It is the version that I have in my head. If I'm good enough to be able to read the Goldberg variations, then actually I don't need Murray Pariah or Rosalind Turek or Angela Hewitt to play it for me. But most people do require that performance in between, and acknowledging the performer or the interpreter or the translator or the dancer or actor or whatever it is doesn't strike me as a huge deal. I mean, it's like, yes, but the cover is a marketing tool and we need to sell things. Honey, if we suddenly win a prize, believe me, you'll find enough space on the cover to put that on there.
I think it is, it's really interesting you talk about this, because publishing is really a team sport. Translator is a key role, the editor is a key role, the people who are doing publicity and marketing and all the rest are key roles without which the book doesn't get out there. And in movies, at the end, you'll have just screens and screens of credits, but unless an editor is thanked in the acknowledgments, they don't appear anywhere in the book. So I think that it's important for translators to get their due, but I also think there's a bigger question in publishing. Why are we as an industry so interested in this, like the lone author makes it happen, and sort of putting them forward and erasing the work of everyone else?
I think it's a very interesting sort of subsequent question that Margot asks, and I think maybe the answer is lies somewhere in this the myth of the auteur. We like to believe that writers just get inspiration from the muse. It just strikes them like a lightning bolt, and the work comes out complete, and it sort of fits into lots of mythologizing and romanticizing about the creative process, which we all like to buy into as consumers, and often, you know, the kind of idolization of the author feeds into that as well, and we start obsessing about their biographies and about, you know, love affairs they were having at the time, etc., etc. And it's not really about the craft. And the craft is, as Margot says, it's a collective, reflective, constant self-editing and mutual, you know, external editing process, and that is just boring. That just doesn't sell any kind of myth of the author. It just doesn't propel that idea, and it doesn't trade in that idea of the author as a genius. So we don't talk about it.
No, it is wider than that. I mean, basically, 19th century Romanticism has an awful lot to answer for. And this sort of, I mean, this is where we get the myth of the artist or the author or the whatever as a lone genius, which means, so when the Rembrandt Commission was set up in the 1930s, there were something of the order of 760 extant Rembrandts. There are now about 300. At the time that Rembrandt was working, at the time that most of the artists of the Dutch Golden Age and whatever, anything that Rembrandt worked on, which included any of the work of his school and people like Judith Lister and so on and so forth, also bore his signature. And the fact that this was craft, the fact that this was a work done by several hands was acknowledged, and that didn't make it less of a Rembrandt, and he still signed it. What we want now is only the bits that he did that nobody else was involved in. And this is, again, this is a, you know, as you're saying, this is the mythology of, you know, the artist as lone tortured genius, where the only time an editor gets mentioned, if it's Gordon Lish, and it's usually Gordon Lish doing the mentioning. No, authors are absolutely.
About this rather than the history, the solution. I mean,
well,
perhaps.
yeah, I would like to say, I would like to, if it's all right, I'd like to point out that, I mean, there's been a lot of coverage and discussion about translators' names on the cover, but as with Frank's, the call that went out with the release of the long list for the International Booker, that is really just a part of it, and it's about visibility and about recognition. But if we're talking about creating translation as a sustainable livelihood, there are many other parts that really need to, the Frank's call was for royalties, for translators to have a stake in the success of the work that they produce. But there are many pieces that go into this puzzle, and that's I think what a lot of the advocacy and activism that's been going on lately, part of the work that I have been doing with a group of translators. We started with the translation committee from PEN America, but it has really sort of reached out, you know, it has broadened out from there. There's a group of translators working in the US who have updated a manifesto on translation, which is soon to be released, which talks about a lot of these, we were calling for a lot of standards and best practices, but we're also calling for everyone within the literary translation community to recognize all of our responsibilities to each other. That, you know, we translators have a responsibility to other translators, that authors and translators have responsibilities to each other, that publishers obviously have responsibilities to translators, that academics, if you're translating it as an academic, that you have, you know, there's a different set of criteria that you're using, book reviewers. There are just so many people in the ecosystem who I think we need to just be a lot more mindful about who all of these players are and how their actions affect each other to create, you know, a more sustainable environment for everyone.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the problem when you're about to be a press release somewhere is, can we focus this on something narrow, please? And the problem is that the visibility or the recognition of translators is not going, I mean, as I said at some point on BBC, when they were talking to me about this, they said, translators' names on covers. I said, there's not much point in putting a translator's name on a cover if you're going to underpay them or if you're going to cut them out of any possible royalties. I mean, that's not recognition, that's tokenism. What we really need
There's
is...
another question I'd like to put on the table, the fact that even if you get royalties, because I was fortunate, my first translation, the agent was a translator himself, so he got me royalties, he gave me the name on the cover, I never had a question about that. But of course, the book never sold enough to give royalties. So it's, in a sense, the name on the cover and even the royalties are moot to a certain extent. And, unless...
It depends on what happens. Okay, so there are maybe, I have translated something just shy of 100 books, fiction and nonfiction. Probably, certainly fewer than a dozen, and maybe fewer than 10 of those have ever earned me royalties. But one of the first books I ever translated, for which I did have a royalty on the cover, has sold just shy of 1 million copies in the United Kingdom. I made more money over the 6 years after it was first published than I was originally paid for translating it. It made it possible for me to be a full-time freelance translator because it had that income coming in. So, I mean, let's face it, most
behind us for one book.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that most books that are published, including most books in English that are published, never earn royalties. That's what an advance is. They calculate it so that you'll never earn a royalty. If you earn royalties, many agents will say, actually, your agent has done a very bad job because they should have got you more of an advance.
Who said that literal thing, that if my authors see royalties, I've done a bad job.
Yeah. But there are many times where that's not the case. I mean, the pseudonymous translator of Stieg Larsson did very well for himself out of it because Christopher McElhose gave him royalty on the 3 books that he translated.
And the name
something that's unheard of, though, is that some publishers actually pay a fee for the translation, and they will pay you a royalty on the first copy sold, from the first copy sold. And so, that's a totally different approach.
Yeah, I mean, fee plus royalty is not uncommon, but usually it's not from copy one. I mean, so the Dutch model, for example, currently, which is negotiated by the Authors Association in the Netherlands with the Publishers Group in the Netherlands, is that the basic fee for translation is already established, and all translators of literary fiction, and this is moot, must get royalties from after 4,000 copies. And this is across all publishers and all translators. It is not up to the individual publisher to decide whether or not they will pay royalties. If it is a literary translation, they must do so. The same is also true in Spain, where actually the terms that they get are terrible, but nonetheless, royalties are factored in as a standard.
I think there's a bigger question, especially in the context of independent publishers, because I think that most people ethically believe that everyone should be paid a living wage. Well, not so much in the US, but a lot of people, especially in the publishing world, believe that everyone should be paid a living wage and compensated for the work we do. And then you look at the size of a pie that a lot of independent presses are dealing with, and you want to increase the size of everyone's slice, and pretty soon you have way more slices than you have pie. So I think that there's one of the questions I've been grappling with is, how do I treat everyone in the ecosystem fairly and compensate them well and still cover our bills and have enough money to pay our bills next month too. So I think it's a question I just kind of want to put out there, especially when we're doing things like short stories and translations and marginalized writers and radical or insurgent voices, how do we increase the size of that pie so that everyone can get a larger slice?
I totally agree with that. I just, sometimes it seems like nobody is trying to negotiate the price of the paper that the book is printed on down when they're trying to, undercut the fee that's going to be paid for the translation. And so that can be frustrating, I think, from our standpoint.
The one thing that a previous generation of publishers did in the UK, it was never the case in the US, is that they allowed the what was called the netbook agreement to die. The netbook agreement meant that publishers could set a specific price for a book that could not be discounted. So they give, obviously, a certain percentage to booksellers, which traditionally used to be 45%. With large chains in the UK and in the US, it went up to 55%. These days with Amazon, it goes up to 65% of the notional cover price of the book. But what has absolutely crippled book publishing in Britain has been the abandonment of the netbook agreement. Because it means that we were in the unedifying position in, say, the early 2000s, where it was cheaper for independent bookshops to buy books from Amazon or from an online retailer than it was to buy them directly from the publisher, because Amazon were deep discounting on things they didn't care about. And so they were selling books at a discount of more than 50%, whereas your average independent bookstore could only buy them from the publisher for 45%. What's interesting is that, this was done at a time where it was said, well, this is a sort of this is a monopoly and you shouldn't be able to do this. And there are two things I would say to that. One is that, what in France is called the cultural exception still holds for books. And Amazon said, we can't possibly open in France. We'd never make a profit in France. They're there. They've dealt with the whole cultural exception. In the last 15 years, there are versions of the netbook agreement in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in the Netherlands, in most of Western Europe, and in Korea and elsewhere. And the very people who are saying, oh, well, why should you be able to set a fixed price that I can't discount? I don't see them out there trying to discount, football tickets or concert tickets or cinema tickets, all of which can be established by the people who are selling them and cannot be thereafter discounted. In fact, if anything, they're inflated. So, the great problem with your pie is there. Sorry.
So lobbying the government to bring back or create some sort of protections for the industry is one example of an option. What are some other things that we can think about that might help us increase the size of the pie or create better conditions?
I think one of them is tied to the netbook agreement, but it's also just a consensus about increasing the price of books generally, increasing the price of books. In 1980, I think I've got some books that I might have bought secondhand in the late 80s, but in 1980, the price of a paperback book was about $4.99, $5.99, something like that. And if you follow inflation from that point, it should be like £23 or something now, and it's not. It's barely doubled. So,
but would people buy? Would enough people be able to buy a book at £23 to compensate for the people who don't buy books? And there were, it's.
I think they would, and I think this is a hugely important point. It's true of paperbacks. It's even more true of hardbacks, where actually the price of the average hardback in the United Kingdom has not changed in the last 20 years at all. It is still $12.99. You try going to a cinema or to a theater and paying the price you were paying 20 years ago. It's not there. Yes, I think there are people who will. I certainly think that the people who currently read will continue to buy. They have managed to participate in other forms of the arts, all of which have gone up in price over time.
Well, I think that this is a conversation we have to continue. And I think we have to think really hard about ways to make publishing, to take the pressure also off publishers, to find a solution for the pile.
Can I ask one question before we do this? How, I mean, for Feminist Press, for example, for Comma, whatever, one of the things that I would have thought it would help is having a distribution network that actually handled independence. And I mean, presumably part of your problem is going to be with distribution.
But distributors are you know, profit-led, organized, profit motive businesses like anyone else. So there have been attempts to have independent alliances in the past. There was one, and still is, I think, run with or by or with Faber, but they work just like any other distribution arrangement, any other set of reps. I mean, distribution is the twofold thing, but they don't. You know, like bookshops, ultimately they're driven by you know, they need to make money, they need to pay the bills. So there isn't. There was an attempt to set up something under the Arts Council many years ago called Signature, and then there was a second attempt through a thing called Impress, but that's more of an umbrella organization on top of a distributor, Central Books. So there's been attempts to do this, but it only works with certain scales, and then certain types of publishing houses. Yeah, it's an ongoing challenge, shall we say.
No, again, it's one of those things where, you know, there is a national distribution service in France. If you print more than 2,000 copies of any book, you are entitled to access the national distribution service. Now, you're not being wrapped.
Frank, I think this is definitely a conversation we have to continue. And next year, Sant Jordi is good, but even long before that. But I don't think we can continue right now. Because I've lost track of how much time we've been on, and Ra has to tell us all about the American way and all of the interventions in the world over the past 80 years. So thank you so much, everybody, for a wonderful conversation and for going from the sublime to the nuts and bolts. And see you. Enjoy Sant Jordi, and see you very soon, I hope.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.